Since the shooting started on December 8th, the Malaya campaign had gone Japan's way. Army air units held the airfields north of Kota Baru and owned the sky over them as Force Z left Singapore. On the evening of December 9th, a submarine sighted them heading north and radioed it in. Bombers went up from Saigon, but the night search found nothing. Warned of aircraft to the north, Admiral Tom Phillips altered course. 10 C-5M scouts were up by 6 a.m. An hour later, 27 level bombers and 61 torpedo bombers swept south along the 105th meridian. Thick, low cloud cover had them all but blind until, at 10:30 a.m., a scout found Force Z through a gap 70 nautical miles southeast of Kuantan. Phillips turned again, but the strike was only minutes away. At 11 a.m., Sonokawa sighted the ships, put out the signal to form up, and the first squadron started down. On paper, the Type 91 aerial torpedo could be dropped from 1,600 feet, but in Sonokawa's drills, even from 650 feet, 9 out of 10 broached, ran deep, or ran wide. So he trained his men to drop from no higher than 330 feet, and even that was a coin flip. 160 feet was better, 65 feet better still, though under flak it was near suicide. Mihoro's level bombers struck both capital ships first. Then 9 G3M2s from Genzan's first squadron drove through heavy flak at HMS Prince of Wales, put their torpedoes in the water, and came out clean. Lieutenant Sadao Takai led 9 G3M2s of the second squadron against Repulse. By noon, Prince of Wales, steering jammed, lay helpless, while Repulse, wreathed in smoke, kept maneuvering and firing. A second wave came, 9 more Mihoro aircraft at Prince of Wales, 8 of the 3rd Squadron under Lieutenant Katsusaku Takahashi at Repulse, coming in at 200 feet through the fire. Takahashi's torpedo hung up and he made 3 runs to shake it loose. Then the G4M ones arrived. At 12:33, Repulse rolled over and sank. At 1:20 p.m., Prince of Wales followed, taking Admiral Phillips and half her crew with her. Japan lost 3 of the new G4M1s and 1 G3M2. Britain lost her centuries-old mastery of the seas and nearly all her territory in Southeast Asia. The age of the battleship was over, and nothing but time stood between Japan and all she wanted. Force Z was the G3M's finest hour. The Mitsubishi G3M1 entered service 5 years before the Pacific War as the Navy Type 96 land-based attack aircraft, RICO for short. Modified again and again, it served in many roles almost to the end. The Allies would later call it Nell as a bomber and patrol plane, Tina as a transport. The project began in 1933 under the future Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, then running the technical division of the Navy's aviation department. He built a doctrine around an all-metal, long-range land-based monoplane to hunt warships far out to sea. The Navy already had one, the Hero G2H1, the Type 95 land-based attack aircraft, a 1932 all-metal design by Lieutenant Commander Jun Okamura at the Hero Naval Arsenal. It first flew on April 29, 1933, and 8 production aircraft followed. But the huge fixed gear dragged its speed down, and it was a headache to build and maintain. Production stopped at 9. They spent the late 30s as transports and never saw combat. The Army Air Service was leaping ahead too. In 1928, Mitsubishi signed an agreement with Junkers for exclusive rights to German patents and licenses for the twin-engine K-47 and 4-engine K-51. German engineers Eugen Schade and Willy Keil trained Mitsubishi's staff and brought German shop floor discipline to its factories. Men sent to Europe and America included Sueo Honjo, Kunosuke Ozawa, Shinshiro Nakata, and Kiro Takahashi. Honjo headed the bomber design team. The Ki-1, Ki-2, and Ki-20 were his, all built for the Army by the end of 1932. Yamamoto took note of that head start. With the Ki-1, Ki-2, and Ki-20 behind it, Mitsubishi knew long-range land-based aircraft best. At his urging, the company got the H-SURE requirement for a long-range twin-engine Scout, no competition. He wanted a testbed for long-distance flight, not a combat type, so the team worked free of the usual service requirements. The design, internally the Ka-9, went to Honjo, Tomio Kubo, and Nobuhiko Kusakabe. They built a clean airframe with retractable gear, keeping the G2H's Junkers-style double-wing flaps and corrugated trailing-edge skin, with a pair of liquid-cooled Hero-type 91 engines, 650 horsepower aside. Test pilot Yoshitaka Kojima flew it in April 1934, and trials went well. On 1,110 gallons, the Ka-9 flew about 2,700 miles, nearly 3,800 at best, and handled better than any Navy twin yet. Deciding separate scouts and bombers made no sense. Yamamoto and the Naval Aviation Department handed Mitsubishi the 9 Sure requirement outright, a long-range bomber based on the Ka-9, with a 1,760-pound bomb load and 7.7mm machine guns. Nakajima pitched its own LB-2 from the licensed Douglas DC-2, but the Navy, sold on the K-9, rejected it. Only one K-9 was ever built, later designated G3M. Its success brought a 1934 order for full development of a 9 Sure land-based bomber, Project 79, with payload, armament, and range spelled out, still pegged to what the G3M had shown it could do. The Ka-15 kept the same slim lines but grew wider inside, room for a crew of 5, 3 retractable turrets, and an underbelly torpedo rack. The Ka-9 wing carried over, smooth skin replacing the corrugated trailing edge, plus a new twin tail and gear reinforced for the load. Finished by June 1935, it flew in July from Kagamigahara, with Kojima at the controls. The first 2 prototypes used the Ka-9's Hero-type 91 engines, turning massive fixed-pitch 4-bladed wooden propellers. Modern radials promised more, but Japan could not yet build them. Mitsubishi had been sending engineers abroad since the late 20s, though, and by the mid-30s it finally had a team that could. One was Mitsubishi's Shinten, a twin, row 14-cylinder radial of 920 horsepower. In 1935, several were in brutal endurance testing, and a pair went into the one and only Ka-9, worth another 15 miles an hour on top and desperately unreliable. The third Ka-15 prototype got 830 horsepower Kinsei, 2 engines, the fourth a pair of Kinsei 3s, 910 horsepower apiece, with Hamilton standard variable pitch propellers. Of 21 prototypes, the fourth became the baseline, approved in June 1936 as the G3M, the Type 96 Rikko. The fifth and sixth kept Hero-type 91 engines. Later that year, one went to the Aminato Air Group at the north end of Honshu for cold weather tests on skis. With the G3M Model 1 in production, the 4 Hero-powered prototypes became G3M-1A, Model 1A, and the 2 Kinsei aircraft G3M-1B, Model 1B, neither official. The first 6 prototypes were tested at the Naval Air Arsenal at Yokosuka, then most went on to the Tateyama Air Group on Honshu for trials and a public debut in the summer of 1936. The one setback was the second prototype, lost with all 5 men aboard on the border between Chosin, today's Korea, and Manchukuo. A broken wooden propeller and aileron flutter were blamed. Metal propellers and mass-balanced ailerons cured it. The Navy also saw the Ka-15 as more than a reconnaissance and anti-shipping type. It could bomb ground targets. All but one of the other 15 prototypes got Kinsei 2s and became long-range, high-altitude bombers with a redesigned fuselage, glazed bombardier nose, and navigator's astrodome. The ventral torpedo mount gave way to 2 universal bomb racks for about 1,760 pounds, single bombs up to 550. The 8th prototype had an enlarged twin tail, the 11th, a 910 horsepower Kinsei, 3 with all-metal Hamilton standard propellers, otherwise the glass-nosed aircraft were identical. Sent to Tateyama in 1936 as the unofficial G3M-1C Model 1C, they flew for years but never went into production. The Navy judged the solid nose version fully capable. The Model 1C prompted a rethink. Testing at Tateyama showed the cockpit, carried over from the Ka-9, was too tight for long-range work, so a roomier one became standard. 34 G3M-1s were built in 1936 and early 37, the last 12 with the bigger cockpit. Production Rikkos went to the Kanoya, Kisarazu, and Ominato air groups, and by the summer of 1937, it was the Navy's main land-based bomber. Mitsubishi had by then developed the 1,075 horsepower Kinsey Model 41, and from early that year it powered the G3M2 Type 96 Model 2, later Model 21. Extra fuselage tanks extended range, the retractable turrets were deleted to cut drag, the ventral position replaced by two waist guns, the dorsal by a 20mm cannon under a clear canopy. The G3M2 stayed in production until late 1941 with minor tweaks. War came to northern China at the Marco Polo Bridge on July 7, 1937, in what Japan called the China Incident. Kanoya and Kisarazu went on alert with their new G3M1s and G3M2s, training daily for the mass raids on Chinese cities the Navy hoped would end the campaign. Shanghai was the key at the Yangtze's mouth in central China, a straight shot upriver less than 200 miles to Nanking and Chiang Kai-shek's government. Wipe out the Chinese Air Force, take Shanghai, and China would have to sue for peace. Japan had done it before in the Shanghai Incident of February 1932, which was over inside a month, so Japan's high command assumed its new bombers could repeat it. 5 years had changed everything. Expecting an attack, Chiang Kai-shek prepared the country's defenses and just before the war hired Claire Lee Chennault, a retired United States Army Air Corps officer and expert on fighter tactics against bombers, to rebuild China's Air Force. China bought aircraft from the United States, Great Britain, Italy, France, Germany, and the Soviet Union, and set up licensed assembly plants, so its Air Force was ready when Japan struck. On August 14th, Kanoya G3M1s and G3M2s left Taipei on Formosa and flew over 400 miles across the East China Sea to strike Hangzhou. Chennault had set up several flight schools, one at Hangzhou. Where the fighting was heaviest, the Chinese had more fighters than Japan had aircraft: 65 Curtiss Hawk 2s, 68 Hawk 3s, and a few Boeing Tu-81s, export P-26 P-shooters. When 18 G3M bombers appeared over Hangzhou, Chinese fighters shot down 6 without a loss. Earlier that day, over 100 Chinese bombers and fighters hit Japanese ships near Shanghai, and over Nanking, Chinese pilots shot down 10 of the 20 D-1As off the carrier Kaga. August 14th is still marked in Taiwan as Air Force Day. Japan replaced Kanoya's losses at once, and on August 15th, 24, Kisarazu bombers flew a 1,150-mile round trip from Omura on Kyushu out over the East China Sea to hit Shanghai and Nanking. No losses this time. The papers called it trans-ocean bombing, strikes flown from the home islands, and made the most of it. The world was stunned. No one had tried this before. European observers rushed to the front and got it badly wrong, reporting the bombers as German-built. More than anything, the RICO fed the Western belief, held until Pearl Harbor, that Japanese aircraft were foreign copies. Analysts could not accept that the 1933 G3M outclassed the Junkers Ju-86 it resembled, which did not fly until 1935. Reality was harsher. Within a week of the Nanking offensive, the cost was unsustainable. The Navy alone lost 54 bombers over the city. Going in at night was no cheaper. The capital was ringed with searchlights, and Chinese fighters flew as well in the dark as by day. The trans-ocean raids soon stopped. The losses exposed critical flaws in the early G3M1 and G3M2. A few hits from light guns and they lit up or blew apart, and they had little to shoot back with. The first month over Shanghai went to the Chinese, and the air offensive stalled until the new Mitsubishi Type 96 fighters got to China to escort the bombers most of the way. Once A-5Ms, the Type 96 carrier fighter, later called Claude, reached the front in September 1937, the offensive flared up again, with RICOs flying from Chinese fields almost daily. Kanoya and Kisarazu were joined by the 2nd Combined Air Group at Kunda Airfield in Shanghai, a mix of fighters, dive bombers, and RICOs from the 13th Air Group. By late October, the A-5Ms had swept Chinese aircraft from over Nanking, letting the bombers rebase to Changzhou, and anything moving between there and Nanking became a target. Free-ranging hunts nearly started the American War 4 years early. On December 12, 1937, 3 G3M1s under Lieutenant Shigeharu Murata, patrolling the Yangtze between Wuhu and Nanking, found the gunboat USS Panay pulling embassy staff and diplomats' families out of the city. Whether it was mistaken identity or deliberate, we still don't know. Each bomber dropped 6 130-pound bombs. One hit the wheelhouse, wrecking the radio room and a 3-inch gun. Next, 12 D-1A dive bombers, later called Suzy, straddled the gunboat with 3 550-pound bombs and sank 2 tankers trying to tow her. 40 minutes later, 3 Type 96 Rikos returned with more 130-pound bombs and sank the Panay in shallow water. A cruiser's E-8N float plane then went after the survivors with 2 65-pound bombs. Only 3 American sailors died and 3 dozen were wounded. Civilian losses ran far higher on a river packed with refugees. Nanking fell the next day. The Chinese pulled back inland and Japan's planned knockout punch became a war of attrition. The targets were deep inland now, well beyond fighter range. In early 1938, Soviet volunteer squadrons reinforced the Chinese at Hankou, the temporary capital 400 miles west of Shanghai. The Hankou raids of spring and summer 1938 exposed how vulnerable the Rikko was. Soviet MR-16s downed 23 of 36 attacking G3Ms without a loss, and their pilots became local heroes. A month later, the bombers came back with a 5M escorts from Wuhu airfield. Even with drop tanks, the fighters had only minutes over the target, but bomber losses fell sharply. Production boomed. 130 aircraft in 1937, 186 by 1938, making the G3M2 the most produced aircraft in Japan. On May 28, 1938, a G3M raid on Canton killed nearly 600 civilians and wounded 900. China begged the world to stop it. Within 7 years, Japanese cities would burn the same way. All summer, the new Mihoro Kokutai flew from Formosa over the South China Sea. In June 1938, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union condemned the bombing of Chinese civilians. Germany and Italy, busy bombing Spain, stayed silent. Tokyo ignored the protests and the raids went on. Canton fell on October 21, 1938, giving Japan the whole Chinese coast. Hankou surrendered 4 days later. Chiang Kai-shek moved his capital 500 miles west to Chongqing, which pushed the bombers to the edge of their range with no escort. Chongqing was first struck in January 1939. By spring, civilians were fleeing every major city still in Chinese hands. G3Ms from Formosa hit Fuzhou almost daily, while Hainan units struck Kunming in Yunnan. By May, the regular Chinese army had broken up, and what was left took to guerrilla war. After a winter lull, by summer 1940, over 100 bombers from 4 naval air groups, the Kanoya, Takao, 13th and 15th Kokutai, were over eastern China daily. New Rikko variants were shaken out over China. Kinsei 42 engines first, then the high-altitude Kinsei 45 in the G3M2 Model 22, then retractable turrets and an experimental version with side blisters. By September 1940 came a revised G3M2 with a 20mm dorsal turret. Mitsubishi also built a gunship escort version, 10 crew, 4 extra 7.7mm side guns, and its own designation, the G6M1. It did not work, but Japan kept trying, converting bombers into escorts through the Pacific War. G3M2 output peaked in 1940, with 10 Kokutai fully equipped on the Type 96 Rikko from Rikujo Kogakiki, land-based attack aircraft. Chitos, Genzan, Kanoya, Kisarazu, Mihoro, Ominato, Takao, and the 1st, 3rd, and 13th Kokutai. The early 1940 G4M1 prototype had the Navy rethinking the Rikko's role, but the Naval General Staff put it off. Demand for the G3M2 was too high and retooling would stall the production lines. Changes stayed defensive, an extra 7.7mm gun firing forward through the windscreen. In April 1941, Nakajima took over G3M assembly, freeing Mitsubishi for the G4M1. June 1942 brought the last upgrade, the Kinsei 57, Kinsei meaning Venus. Nakajima built this G3M3 alone through February 1943, by which time the old workhorse was leaving the front line. By fall 1940, Japan renewed the Chongqing offensive. G4M1s joining the G3M2 raids, escorted by Zeros. The world barely noticed, its eyes on Europe, the Blitzkrieg, the fall of France, and by mid-41, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. By that fall, talks between Tokyo and Washington had stalled, and the Pacific was sliding toward war. With war coming, the Naval Command pulled most land-based bomber units out of China in August 1941 and moved them to French Indochina, Formosa, and the home islands to retrain. By December, before the attacks on American, British, and Dutch possessions, over 200 G3Ms were stationed overseas and 52 at home. Airframes were adapted too. The G3M 2K trainer, converted from battle-damaged bombers, appeared in 1938 with the Matsushima, Tateyama, and Yokosuka training units. Few were built, but they trained crews through 1943, some sources say into spring 1944. The high-altitude reconnaissance G3M2 Kai was built on new airframes with a 50-centimeter wide angle camera in place of the bombardier's station, and climbed to 29,500 feet out of reach of most fighters. The first rolled out in February 1941 and passed its trials at Yokosuka, and by April 36 of them equipped 3 special-purpose squadrons of the 3rd Kogutai on Formosa under Captain Yoshio Kame. They flew their first covert mission on April 18, 1941, out of Takao over the northern Philippines. In May and June, they photographed the southern Philippines, Rabaul on New Britain, Guam, and French Indochina. They worked out of Palau, Truk, Tinian, and Hainan, with auxiliary ships along the routes to handle radio relay and navigation. By late November, they were back over the Philippines. Light gray and unmarked, they were never intercepted. But American early warning radar did pick up an unidentified twin-engine aircraft high over Guam in June and Luzon in early December. The Japanese were sure they could not be seen. They had never heard of radar. War came at dawn on December 8, 1941. Japanese time, December 7th in the Americas. The first strikes went to G3M2s of the Takao Kokutai from southern Formosa against American airfields in the northern Philippines. Fog kept 54 bombers down until 10 in the morning. Then one flipped on takeoff and exploded, killing its crew and closing the field until the wreckage was dragged clear. The other 53 got off at 10:45 and hit Clark Field and its satellite strips hard. That day, 36 G3M2s of the Chitos Kokutai struck Wake Island from Kwajalein, wrecking most of VMF-211's Wildcats on the ground. Far to the southwest, G3M2s of the Mihoro Kokutai flew from French Indochina against British positions at Singapore, while Genzan's torpedo bombers hunted Force Z in the Malacca Strait. On December 10th, Prince of Wales and Repulse went down, the first capital ships ever sunk by air attack at sea. It stunned Allies and Japanese alike. In 2 days, Imperial Navy bombers had done more than every European bomber force managed in the First World War. For Allied troops cut off in the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, the Type 96 became a familiar sight. In early February 1942, Ricos of the 4th Kokutai reached Rabaul on New Britain, and in May they fought in the Battle of the Coral Sea, hitting American ships and losing 4 of 27. Then the Americans landed on Guadalcanal that August, and from then on, the Type 96 fought a defensive war. From day one, the G3M2s left at home were on defensive duty. Shortly before noon on April 18, 1942, 29 G3M2s of the Kisarazu Kokutai took off after the task force built around USS Hornet. A submarine had spotted it on April 10th, on course for Japan. Other units stood by once the Americans closed to within 200 nautical miles. They found nothing and came home that afternoon. 2 hours later, 16 B-25s, led by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, bombed Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya. Soon after, the Kisarazu Kokutai moved to Timor, then by mid-August 1942 to Rabaul to help retake Guadalcanal. Rabaul was the beginning of the end for a design aging fast. By October 1942, 5 Kokutai there flew the Type 96 Rico, and some were already the newer G3M3, the Model 23. In a major reorganization on November 1, 1942, Every kokutai at Rabaul lost its name for a number in the 700s. Chitos became the 703rd, Genzan the 755th, Kisarazu the 707th, Misawa the 705th, the 4th Kokutai the 702nd. Kanoya, Mihoro, and Takao were renumbered too, and only mainland training units kept their names. Newer groups flew G3Ms too. The 722nd, raised in 44 for the Philippines and later reformed in Japan as a kamikaze unit, and the 762nd, a night torpedo bomber group, formed there that November. In the second half of 1943, G3Ms left frontline units for vital transport, liaison, and patrol work, and just about every independent command kept a couple as personal transports. One support role went back before the war. The G3M was picked as tow plane for the Kugisho MXY-5 assault glider built for 11 armed troops. Low priority made the work crawl. Design began in August 1941, flight testing in February 1942. But not until 44 did the improved MXY-5A fly as it should. By then, Japan had bigger worries than gliders, and the program was scrapped. The Nell came into its own on maritime patrol. Early G3M3 patrol aircraft were nearly identical to the bombers. They flew with the 901st and 951st Kokutai under the 1st Escort Fleet, which had begun as the 1st Escort Squadron in November 43 and grew into the Grand Escort Command in 44. Their job was the sea lanes, Singapore to the home islands. They were among Japan's first convoy escorts and sub-hunters working from bases strung along the route: Saigon, Singapore, Manila, Takao, Okinawa, Tateyama, Sumatra, and the Chinese coast. About half the G3M3 Model 23 patrol aircraft carried surface search radar. The first sets went to the 901st Kokutai at Manila, whose crews sighted the American invasion fleet on October 24, 1944, just before the Battle of Leyte Gulf. In July 1944, the escort squadron was upgraded to a full fleet, and the G3M3Q appeared, an anti-submarine version with a magnetic anomaly detector to pick up submerged hulls. 20 to 40 frontline Nells were converted. At least 2 got an extra 20mm cannon under the nose, angled down for surface targets. The G3M3Q looked deadly on paper. Japanese records credit the 901st Kokutai alone with 20 submarines by the end of 44. Allied records confirm none. It flew nicely and it could carry a load, so a transport version came along early. In 1937, as the G3M1 Model 11 went into mass production, the Yokosuka Arsenal, later Kugisho, turned one out. The L3Y1 Model 11, which the Allies would codename Tina. So who actually flew the Nell? The list runs long. Chitose Kokutai, 1940 to November 42, under Captain Fujiro Ohashi. Home at Chitose. Then Ishikari, Kwajalein, Wake, Rabaul, and Midway support in July 42. Genzan Kokutai, 1939 to November 42, under Captain Kamio Sonokawa. Korea, China, Saigon, Malaya, Rabaul. Kanoya Kokutai, April 1936 to November 42, under Captain Shizue Ishii. Taipei, Hangzhou, Saigon, the Dutch East Indies, Kavieng, Buin, the Solomons. Kisarazu Kokutai, August 1937 to November 42. Omura, China, Kisarazu itself, Timor, Rabaul. Matsushima Kokutai, a training unit. August 1944 to war's end, the home islands and French Indochina. Mihoro Kokutai, July 1938 to November 42. Formosa, China, French Indochina, Malaya, Tinian, the Kurils. Misawa Kokutai, formed March 1, 1942. Japan, Saipan, Tinian, Kavieng, Rabaul. Its G3Ms were mostly trainers and transports. Ominato Kokutai, 1936 to 41, was a second-line unit that sat at Omura and never deployed. Takao Kokutai, 1939 to November 42. China, the Philippines, Kavieng, Captain Kamio Sonokawa, who had led Genzan, took it over from April 42 to February 43. Tateyama Kokutai, a training unit, June 1936 to late 43. Its Honshu base later became a training field for the 901st. Yokosuka Kokutai, 1938 to war's end at Yokosuka, trained transport aircrews under Captain Isamu Inoue. The Yokosuka arsenal kept G3Ms on strength from 1936 to the end of the war. 4th Kokutai, 1941 to November 42 at Truk and Rabaul. 13th Kokutai, July 1937 to 41. Omura, Shanghai, Hankou. 15th Kokutai, July 1938 to 40. Omura and Hankou. 203rd Kokutai, February 1944 to war's end. A mixed outfit at Kagoshima with fighters, recon aircraft, and torpedo bombers flying anti-submarine patrols off Japan. 705th Kokutai, 1942 to October 15th, 43, over Rabaul and the Dutch East Indies under Lieutenant Commander Tomoyoshi Hori. The 707th lasted less than a year, raised in 42, disbanded that November 30th from Rabaul, Buen, and Timor with a few Nells for airlift. The 722nd flew G3Ms and G4Ms on special attack missions in the Philippines from 1944 and was wiped out there by January 45. 755th Kokutai, 1942 to November 43, in the home islands and on Tarawa. 762nd Kokutai, February 15th to December 20th, 1944. Japan, Formosa, the Philippines, with several G3Ms as night torpedo trainers. 901st Kokutai, September 1943 to war's end, flew patrol and escort with mixed aircraft from Shanghai, Hong Kong, Hainan, French Indochina, the Philippines, and Formosa. Commander Kamide held it to December 44, then Rear Admiral Shigetada Horiuchi. 951st Kokutai, December 1944 to war's end. Mixed patrol and escort in Japan and China. 1001st Kokutai, 1944 to May. 45 in Formosa and Japan, formed for transport, later varied work. Its G3Ms and L3Ys were always transports. 1006th Kokutai, July 1943 to war's end, strictly transport. Its G3Ms and L3Ys hauled nothing but cargo and passengers. Beyond these, modified G3M transports, L3Ys, and impressed civil airliners served with nearly every unit of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, hauling people, mail, and staff officers around the empire to the end.